One child, one badge, and one neighbor's prejudice, what unfolded stunned the entire neighborhood. The neighborhood was quiet, wrapped in the golden calm of a late afternoon. Sunlight spilled across the rows of suburban homes, painting their white fences and freshly trimmed hedges in warm tones. Shadows stretched long and soft, reaching across the sidewalks like lazy arms. It was one of those days when the air seemed to hum with stillness, where nothing extraordinary ever seemed possible. Birds hopped between branches, sprinklers clicked rhythmically in distant yards, and the faint hum of a lawnmower drifted from a street over dot at the edge of one driveway. An 11-year-old boy named Ethan was spinning lazy circles on his bike. His skin glowed in the fading light, his short curly hair catching the sun. A bright red t-shirt flapped gently against his small frame, his denim shorts showing the quick motion of his legs pedaling with determination. His sneakers scuffed the pedals now and then, squeaking faintly as the wheels spun. Ethan's laughter echoed into the stillness, high and bright, the unmistakable sound of a child living inside his own world of freedom. He leaned forward on his black and red BMX, wobbling as he tried to balance without hands. For a moment, he managed it, stretching his arms out wide as though he were soaring like the birds above. His grin was wide, his eyes sparkling with both joy and mischief. From a distance, there was nothing unusual about the scene, nothing threatening, nothing that might invite suspicion. Just a child on his bike, a boy embracing the small freedoms of an afternoon before dinner, his laughter bouncing against the backdrop of ordinary houses and manicured lawns. Yet beneath the softness of the moment, there was an invisible thread tugging at the air, something fragile that hinted not everything was as safe as it appeared. Ethan circled the same stretch of sidewalk again and again, carving a track that only he could see. Each turn was precise in his imagination, as though he were racing against invisible opponents, pedaling faster when his mind told him he was about to win. He slowed only to glance at the flowers blooming in his neighbor's garden or to wave at the family dog that barked lazily behind a fence. For Ethan, this was freedom, the kind of unshakable innocence that lives in the space between childhood and the world's harsher lessons. His driveway, his street, his laughter, it all seemed to belong. And yet, the universe has a cruel way of reminding us how easily innocence can be misunderstood, how quickly joy can be questioned. The longer he rode, the more shadows began to stretch, and the warmth of the afternoon carried a stillness that seemed to hold its breath. The sound of his tires rolling against the pavement echoed louder against the silence, as if even the neighborhood itself was pausing, waiting. Ethan didn't notice, not yet. He was too focused on making the tightest turns he could, too excited by the challenge of balance and speed. His world was small in that moment, simple and safe, but sometimes safety exists only in perception. Sometimes the peace of an ordinary afternoon masks the weight of unseen eyes. Ethan slowed his bike, coasting gently toward the curb. He pushed his foot against the ground, letting the bike steady. The sun caught the edge of his smile, making it glow. He leaned his head back and looked up at the sky, tracing the slow movement of a cloud. He laughed again, this time quieter, almost to himself. The air carried no warning, no sound yet announced what was to come. But if someone had been listening closely, listening beyond the chirp of birds and the hum of sprinklers, they might have heard the quiet creak of a porch step across the street. They might have noticed the way blinds shifted in a nearby window. They might have seen that innocence, as pure as it was, had already drawn suspicion it did not deserve. For now, Ethan's laughter still filled the neighborhood. His bike still spun in bright, hopeful circles. The afternoon still looked golden, safe, and ordinary. But the undercurrent of tension, thin, almost invisible, was tightening with every turn of his wheels. Across the street, behind a tidy porch with white railings and pots of wilting geraniums, Mrs. Caldwell stood watching. She had been standing there longer than she would admit, her thin fingers curled tightly around the edge of her phone, her eyes fixed on the boy riding his bike. Her face was sharp, her jawline clenched with a kind of practiced disapproval. Lines etched deeply around her mouth gave her the look of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of frowning. Her pale skin caught the sun awkwardly, glowing faintly red as the afternoon light slanted across her porch. "That boy doesn't live here," she muttered under her breath, her voice low, laced with suspicion. She narrowed her eyes, as if squinting might transform the scene into the danger she was trying to see. Ethan pedaled past again, circling with the easy rhythm of a child at play. His laughter rang out, bright and harmless, but Mrs. Caldwell heard something else in it, something she convinced herself was mocking, invasive, a kind of audacity that shouldn't belong here. Every turn of his wheels tightened her frown. She saw not a child, but what her imagination painted, someone circling homes, scouting their layouts, memorizing who was in and who was out. The very ordinariness of his play became, to her eyes, a sign of calculation. She told herself she knew this pattern, she had seen it before, or so she claimed silently. Her breathing grew shallow, the kind that precedes indignation more than fear. She shifted her stance, glancing at the houses nearby, as if expecting her neighbors to share her watchfulness. But most curtains stayed still, most blinds remained shut. This was her moment alone, her self-appointed duty to notice what others ignored. "That's no residence boy," she whispered again, more firmly this time. "He's not from here." The truth that Ethan lived exactly where his bike now paused never crossed her mind. It didn't fit the picture she had already drawn, and she wasn't about to let reality erase her assumptions. Her thoughts hardened into certainty, certainty into judgment. She tapped her phone awake with a snap of decision, her pale thumb hovering over the keypad. A sigh escaped her lips, sharp and indignant, as if the weight of responsibility had landed on her shoulders alone. With one final glance at Ethan, she lifted the phone to her ear. Her voice sharpened, taking on the tone of urgency reserved for emergencies, though no true emergency existed. "Yes, I'd like to report suspicious activity," she said quickly. "A young black male teenager, maybe older, loitering around. Holmes, circling. Looks like he's up to something." Her words spilled out with practiced certainty, each one exaggerating what her eyes had truly seen. Ethan's laughter was twisted into menace, his circling bike ride reshaped into the actions of a trespasser. She spoke as though she were saving the neighborhood, when in truth, she was simply feeding her own prejudice. On the other end, the dispatcher's voice remained calm, professional, assuring her that officers were on their way. Mrs. Caldwell lowered the phone slowly, a grim satisfaction curling across her lips. She slipped the device into her cardigan pocket, her chin lifting in the posture of someone who believed she had done the right thing. Her gaze flicked back to Ethan, who remained oblivious. He pedaled faster now, his red shirt a blur against the golden light, his laughter unbroken by the storm quietly brewing across the street. Mrs. Caldwell folded her arms across her chest. She stood straighter, her pale figure framed by the porch railings, the air around her thick with self-righteousness. In her mind, she was the watchful guardian, the one who noticed what others ignored. But the truth, as invisible as it was undeniable, was that she had just set in motion something far heavier than she understood. And in that still golden afternoon, the boy rode on, free for a few more moments, while the weight of a single phone call began to draw closer, sirens waiting to pierce the peace. The quiet hum of summer cicadas was broken by a new sound, a low mechanical growl creeping down the street. At first it was distant, blending with the rustle of leaves, but within moments it became unmistakable, the slow roll of a patrol car. Its engine hummed against the silence, cutting through the suburban calm with a weight that felt heavier than its size. Neatly trimmed hedges and sunlit lawns reflected on its polished doors as it pulled to the curb. The soft chatter of neighbors died down, curtains shifted discreetly, and the once peaceful street seemed to hold its breath. Ethan, mid-laugh, was the last to notice. He was coasting down a gentle curve in the sidewalk, his front wheels squeaking faintly with each spin. When he finally turned his head and saw the car, confusion clouded his young face. His laughter trailed off like an unfinished melody, replaced by silence that didn't belong to an 11-year-old boy on a summer afternoon. The patrol car came to a halt, its brakes sighing as if exhaling disapproval. The doors opened with measured precision, and two uniformed officers stepped out. They were broad-shouldered men, their navy blue uniforms crisp, badges glinting beneath the sun's glare. Their eyes swept the street with trained sharpness, pausing on the boy in the red t-shirt as though he were a puzzle to be solved, a threat to be neutralized. Their presence was heavy, casting a shadow larger than the car itself. Ethan froze. The front tire of his bike squeaked as he slowed to a full stop, feet pressing nervously against the pavement. His small hands tightened around the handlebars, knuckles paling, his wide eyes darting between the officers and the house behind him. His mind fumbled for explanations. Had he done something wrong? Was he not supposed to ride here? His chest tightened, the easy rhythm of his breathing broken by a new, unnameable fear. The officers moved with purpose. One adjusted his belt, his right hand settling near the hard outline of his holster, fingers flexing unconsciously against the smooth leather. His boots crunched on the pavement as he closed the distance, his voice firm, stripped of warmth. "Son," he said, his tone carrying the weight of authority that made even adults shrink. "Step off the bike." The words landed heavy in the air. They weren't loud, but they sliced through Ethan's thoughts, pulling his young body into stillness. He didn't argue. He didn't even think to. Slowly, shakily, he swung one leg over the frame and stood on the sidewalk, the bike wobbling unsteadily beside him. His eyes remained wide, lips parting but no words escaping. He didn't know what he was supposed to say. He only knew the look in their eyes, serious, unyielding, as if they were here for someone dangerous. And for the first time that afternoon, Ethan wondered if that someone was him. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains and blinds, their silhouettes faint but unmistakable. A hush swept across the block, curiosity tangled with discomfort. And across the street, Mrs. Caldwell stood straighter on her porch, her arms crossed tightly, chin raised in satisfaction. She watched with the self-importance of someone who believed she had been proven right. One of the officers spoke again, slower this time, though the firmness never wavered. "What are you doing out here, son?" His eyes scanned Ethan's shirt, his shorts, his sneakers, searching for signs that justified the call. Ethan swallowed hard, his small voice barely finding its way out. "Just riding my bike," he whispered, the words trembling. The officer's gaze narrowed, flicking briefly to his partner. The second man said nothing, only stood a few steps back, arms folded, watching as though waiting for proof to emerge. To Ethan, their silence was louder than their questions. His heartbeat drummed in his ears, and the once warm afternoon seemed to chill around him. The air hung heavy, filled with suspicion and a fear that Ethan couldn't quite name. He wanted to go home, to call for his mother, but his legs wouldn't move. And so he stood there, an 11-year-old boy in the middle of his own neighborhood, caught beneath the shadow of authority he had never asked to face. The bike lay tilted beside him, its squeaky wheels still spinning faintly, a fragile echo of innocence in a moment that had already begun to unravel. Ethan's lips parted, his voice fragile as if each word had to climb over a mountain of fear before escaping. I live here," he stammered, his words trembling in the warm air. The admission should have been enough, simple and clear. But in the silence that followed, the officers exchanged a look, one of doubt, of quiet disbelief. It wasn't the look of men hearing truth. It was the look of men searching for cracks in a child's story. One officer stepped closer, his boots crunching against the concrete. "You live here?" His tone was sharp, questioning, more accusation than inquiry. Where exactly? Ethan turned his head, his small finger lifting to point at the house just behind him, the house with the familiar red shutters and the swing set in the yard. His home, the place where his laughter had always belonged. But the officer's face remained stony. Do you have any identification? School ID? Anything with your name on it? Ethan's eyes widened in panic. His throat tightened, and he shook his head quickly. I don't. I wasn't carrying anything, just my bike. The bike, as if in sympathy, gave a faint squeak when he shifted his weight. His hands clutched the handlebars so tightly that his knuckles stood out pale against his brown skin. The metal felt cold and hard beneath his fingers, though the sun still burned hot above. The other officer let out a slow breath, crossing his arms as though already unconvinced. Kids around here usually carry something. A phone. A wallet. You sure you're telling us the truth? The question sliced through Ethan's chest like a blade. His mouth opened, but only a small gasp escaped. He had never been asked to prove his right to stand in his own driveway. He had never needed to. Until now. Across the street, Mrs. Caldwell straightened proudly on her porch, her arms crossing like a judge overseeing her verdict. Her lips pressed into a thin, smug line, satisfaction radiating from every inch of her stiff posture. To her, the boy's shaking voice confirmed her suspicion. To her, his lack of ID was proof enough. See? She muttered under her breath, too quiet for anyone but herself to hear. I knew it. Didn't belong here. Her pale figure, framed against the peeling white railings, stood like a monument of self-righteousness. She didn't fidget, didn't falter. She basked in the certainty that she was right, that her call had been justified. The atmosphere around Ethan thickened, the golden warmth of the afternoon now suffocating. The world felt smaller, the street narrower, as though invisible walls were closing in. His chest heaved in shallow breaths, his young body trembling under the weight of authority pressing down on him. His small fingers slipped slightly on the cozy handlebars, slick with nervous sweat. He wanted to cry, but he swallowed it down, his throat burning from the effort. He wanted to shout louder, to demand that they believe him, but his voice shrank, smothered by the disbelief in their eyes. Officers loomed above him, their shadows stretching long across the pavement, blending into the growing unease that hung in the air. The silence between questions was heavy, each pause filled with suspicion. Son, the first officer said again, this time slower, sterner. We need to be sure. Are you telling us the truth? Ethan nodded desperately, his curls bobbing as his head shook with fear and frustration. Yes, I promise. I live here. Please. Please believe me. But the plea only deepened their skeptical frowns. Behind him, the swing set in his yard swayed slightly in the breeze, a quiet reminder of innocence now overshadowed by doubt. The house stood firm, familiar, and safe, yet it seemed impossibly far away, just beyond the reach of his shaking hands. And across the street, Mrs. Caldwell's eyes narrowed, her lips twisting into something colder than a smile. She had become the architect of this moment, the orchestrator of fear, standing in self-proclaimed victory while a child's laughter had been replaced by trembling silence. The golden afternoon had shifted. What had begun as an ordinary day of play was now a theater of suspicion. With Ethan trapped at center stage, his innocence questioned, his truth ignored, his fear growing heavier with each passing second. And though the cicadas still hummed, and the sun still painted long shadows across the lawns, the peace of the neighborhood was gone. In its place lingered unease, thick and unrelenting, waiting for what would happen next. The tension clung thick in the air, wrapping itself around Ethan like invisible chains. His breath came quick, shallow, his small frame trembling beside his bicycle. The officer's stern eyes lingered on him, their questions sharp, their suspicion louder than his quiet protests. And then, the sound of tires on gravel cut through it all. A sleek black SUV glided down the street, its engine low and smooth, almost predatory in the silence. It slowed deliberately, turning into the very driveway Ethan had pointed to with his trembling finger. The metallic glint of polished paint reflected the afternoon sun, casting streaks of gold along its curves. Ethan's eyes darted toward it, his heart leaping in recognition. Relief flickered across his face, but fear kept him rooted in place. Vehicle stopped cleanly in front of the house, and for a moment, time seemed to pause. Doors creaked open around the block as neighbors leaned out. Blinds shifted just enough for eyes to peer through. The air, once buzzing with cicadas, quieted to a hush of collective anticipation. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a tall black woman in a tailored navy suit. The sharp cut of the fabric clung to her frame with understated authority. A white blouse peeked beneath her jacket, and polished heels struck the pavement with crisp, deliberate clicks that echoed down the street. Her presence was immediate, commanding, undeniable. The kind of presence that turned heads not because of noise, but because of silence. She radiated composure, strength honed by years of discipline. And yet, her eyes, dark and focused, were not on the officers, nor the watching neighbors. They were locked on Ethan. "Mom," Ethan whispered, the word cracking under the weight of his fear. She strode forward without hesitation, each step slicing through the heavy atmosphere. Her heels clicked against the pavement in a rhythm that grew louder with every stride, like a drumbeat of inevitability. Her shoulders squared, her chin lifted, and her gaze never wavered from her son's wide, tear-filled eyes. The officers shifted, instinctively straightening as she approached. One moved his hand away from his holster, almost sheepishly, though his jaw tightened as if to compensate. The other cleared his throat, trying to mask the sudden stiffness in his stance. Across the street, Mrs. Caldwell stiffened. Her arms, once folded smugly, dropped slightly as confusion flickered across her stern face. She tilted her head, lips parting just enough to reveal the crack in her certainty. Neighbors who had been watching silently leaned closer to their windows. Some pressed their hands to their mouths. Others exchanged glances that said more than words could have. The air thrummed with the knowledge that something important was about to unfold. The woman reached Ethan's side, her hand brushing gently against his shoulder. The boy's trembling stilled instantly, his small frame leaning into her touch. His wide eyes, filled with tears that hadn't yet fallen, softened as though a shield had materialized around him. Her gaze lifted, finally settling on the officers. The silence stretched between them like a drawn bowstring. Her expression was calm, but beneath it was steel. Authority emanated from her in a way that had nothing to do with the tailored suit or polished shoes. It was in the way she held herself, the way she looked at men trained to intimidate and made them blink first. For a long moment, no one spoke. The cicadas had gone quiet again, the whole street straining toward the confrontation they could sense, but not yet hear. And then, with a voice as even as it was unyielding, she broke the silence. "Is there a reason you're questioning my son?" Her words were simple, but they rippled through the air, heavy with unspoken power. The officers glanced at each other. Mrs. Caldwell's lips pressed thin again, though her face had lost its proud certainty. Ethan gripped his mother's hand now, his fear easing but not gone. The street held its breath, waiting for what would come next. The air snapped with tension as the tall woman's voice cut through it like a blade. "Why?" she demanded, her tone sharp and unwavering. "Are you questioning my child?" Her words echoed down the hushed street, bouncing off manicured lawns and neat porches. There was no mistaking the authority in her voice. It was not simply a mother's outrage, but something deeper, forged from years of command. The lead officer, caught mid-breath, straightened abruptly. His chest rose as if trying to make himself taller, but the faint flicker of unease betrayed him. He glanced at his partner, who shifted awkwardly, suddenly fascinated by the pavement. "Ma'am," The officer began, clearing his throat. "We received a call. A report of suspicious activity. We were told a teenager was loitering around homes. His explanation faltered beneath her gaze. Her eyes, dark and unblinking, pinned him in place. There was no room for excuses here, no space to hide behind vague words. Ethan clung to her hand, his small fingers gripping tightly. Drawing courage from her presence, her other hand moved deliberately, reaching into the inner pocket of her tailored navy jacket. For a heartbeat, the officers stiffened, their training kicking in, but then the glint of metal caught the sunlight. She held it high, steady so there was no mistaking it. A badge, not just any badge. Its lettering caught the sun in bold, undeniable. Authority, Chief of Police Daniels. The street seemed to exhale in unison. The officers froze, the weight of the moment crashing over them. Their postures, rigid and domineering only seconds before, faltered instantly. The sharp edge in their voices dulled into shame. The man who had kept his hand near his holster let it fall, his fingers twitching nervously at his side. His partner shifted uncomfortably, his face flushed beneath the brim of his cap. Chief Daniels, the lead officer stammered, words tumbling over themselves in desperation. We had no idea, but the excuses sounded hollow, even to him. Across the street, Mrs. Caldwell's proud stance shattered. Her lips, once curled in smug satisfaction, parted in disbelief. Color drained from her cheeks until her face was as pale as her pressed blouse. She staggered slightly against the porch railing, her arms falling limply to her sides. Whispers stirred like wind through the neighborhood. Curtains twitched, blinds shifted, doorways filled with quiet onlookers who had waited for this very moment. Their murmurs rippled from one house to the next, disbelief mixing with awe. That's the chief? Her son? She called the cops on the chief's boy? The words circled like a storm, growing louder though spoken in hushed tones. Chief Daniels' gaze never left the officers. "So," she said slowly, her voice low but commanding, "a child riding his bike in front of his own home is suspicious? Suspicious enough to warrant this?" She lifted her chin toward Ethan, whose trembling had only just begun to ease. The officers shifted their weight, shame pressing down heavier than the late afternoon heat. Neither dared to meet her eyes. Ethan's small voice broke through, hesitant, but strong enough to be heard. "Mom, I told them I live here. They didn't believe me." The chief's jaw tightened, a shadow of pain flashing across her otherwise controlled face. She drew Ethan closer to her side, her hand resting firmly on his shoulder. Her badge still gleamed in her hand, catching the last rays of the sun, undeniable proof of who she was. Proof that the officer's authority here was not just challenged, it had been eclipsed entirely. Dotted on the porch, Mrs. Caldwell shrank in on herself, her self-righteousness dissolving into silence. The same silence that now filled the street, heavy and telling. What had begun as a golden, ordinary afternoon was now transformed into a reckoning, one that left no doubt. The truth had arrived, and it carried both justice and shame in its wake. Ethan's small body trembled against his mother's side, the fear of the last few minutes still etched into his wide, watery eyes. His bicycle leaned abandoned on the sidewalk, its front wheels spinning lazily, the faint squeak a ghostly reminder of the innocence interrupted. Chief Daniels lowered herself gracefully, knees pressing into the warm concrete. She was no longer the commanding figure with a badge in hand here. She was simply a mother, her heart breaking at the sight of her child's shaken frame. Her hands cupped his face gently, thumbs brushing away the tears that clung stubbornly to his lashes. "You did nothing wrong, baby," she whispered, her voice low, tender, meant for him alone. "Do you hear me?" "Nothing." Ethan nodded quickly, though the lump in his throat wouldn't let him speak. He pressed his forehead against her shoulder, clinging to the fabric of her suit as if it were a lifeline. For the first time since the patrol car had arrived, his breathing began to steady. She held him there a moment longer, shielding him with her presence. Then, slowly she rose. The transformation was seamless. From mother to leader, from comfort to confrontation. She stood tall, her navy suit sharp against the fading golden light, her heels firm on the pavement. Her eyes locked onto the officers, and when she spoke, her voice carried across the entire street. "This," she began, each word measured, her tone steady yet burning with restrained fire, "is what happens when bias dictates judgment." The silence thickened. Even the cicadas seemed to hold back their chorus. Neighbors leaned closer behind their blinds, caught in the gravity of her words. My son was not a threat. He was not loitering, not suspicious. He was a child on his bike in front of his own home. Her gaze cut like steel, sweeping. From one officer to the other, then across the street to Mrs. Caldwell's stiff figure. "And yet you treated him like a suspect, like a problem to be solved." The officers shifted uncomfortably, shame painted across their faces. Their earlier authority had withered, replaced now with something closer to regret. One of them bowed his head, his voice low and awkward. "Chief, we're sorry. We didn't mean to." But she raised her hand, silencing the excuse before it could fumble its way into the air. Her voice grew sharper, though never lost its control. "Sorry won't undo what he felt. Sorry won't erase the fear that you put into a child who should never have known it." She took a breath, her shoulders squared, her words a deliberate strike. Next time, it could cost a life. The weight of that truth landed hard, reverberating across the quiet street. The officers bowed their heads further, their apologies dissolving into murmurs that sounded more like confessions than excuses. On her porch, Mrs. Caldwell shrank visibly. Her arms, once crossed proudly, now hung at her sides like dead weight. She shifted her stance, retreating half a step, her face pale and expressionless. Her eyes darted toward the chief, then away, unable to withstand the power in her gaze. The woman who had stood so smugly minutes ago now seemed smaller, diminished. Her confidence stripped bare by the truth ringing in the air. She didn't dare speak. She couldn't. Ethan clung to his mother's hand now, calmer, steadier, though his eyes still glistened. He watched her not as the chief, not even as the authority who silenced men in uniform, but as his protector, his mother, his shield against a world that had turned suspicious eyes on him for no reason at all. Chief Daniels let the silence linger, knowing it was louder than anything else she could say. Her words floated there still, carried on the quiet breeze. Bias, judgment, life, and no one on that street, not the officers, not the neighbors, not even Mrs. Caldwell, could pretend they hadn't heard them. The evening air had grown cooler, the sun sinking lower behind the rows of neat suburban houses. Golden light spilled across the lawns, stretching shadows long and thin, as if the neighborhood itself was weary from what had just transpired. Ethan clung tightly to his mother's hand, his small fingers gripping as though letting go might mean the world would swallow him whole. His bicycle lay forgotten on the edge of the driveway, its wheel no longer spinning. The innocence of a boy's afternoon ride had been shattered, replaced by a memory that would never quite fade. Chief Daniels bent slightly, brushing a curl from her son's forehead. Her expression softened as she looked at him, relief mixing with sorrow, pride intertwined with pain. She had worn many faces today, the protector, the leader, the chief of police. But here, in this moment, she was just a mother, holding her child after the storm. Across the street, silence pressed heavy upon the homes. Curtains shifted, blinds twitched, and neighbors who had watched every second now stood frozen in their own discomfort. They had seen the patrol car pull in, had seen the boy halted mid-play, had seen the way suspicion took root in an instant. And now they had seen it undone not by protest or shouting, but by the undeniable truth that the boy belonged, and the woman they doubted commanded more authority than they had ever imagined. For some, shame crept in quietly, a whisper at the back of their minds. For others, denial hardened their faces as they retreated from their windows, unwilling to wrestle with what they had witnessed. But no one could escape it. The image lingered. A child nearly branded a threat for simply being present. A mother forced to defend her son in the very place meant to be their refuge. Chief Daniels straightened, her hand resting protectively on Ethan's shoulder. Her eyes swept across the quiet street, locking momentarily on the neighbors peeking through their blinds. She didn't need to say another word. The lesson had already been laid bare for them to wrestle with in the privacy of their own hearts. Prejudice distorts reality. It had turned the joyful sound of a child's laughter into something suspicious. It had twisted the simple motion of circling a driveway into scouting houses. It had transformed a harmless afternoon into an accusation. And in doing so, it had endangered innocence itself. Authority and justice mean nothing when blinded by bias, the uniforms, the flashing lights, the stern commands. None of it mattered when they were rooted in an assumption born not of truth but of fear and prejudice. The officer's power had faltered the moment the badge of higher authority revealed itself, but the deeper failure had occurred long before, when they chose suspicion over compassion. And yet, true power had shown itself clearly today, not in weapons, not in raised voices, not in intimidation. It was found in courage, in the trembling boy who managed to speak, "I live here." It was found in truth, in a mother who stood unwavering, demanding accountability. And it was found in the ability to stand against injustice, even in one's own backyard, even when the injustice came from those sworn to protect. Ethan leaned into his mother's side, his eyes still wide, his body still holding remnants of fear. But beneath that fear was something new, an awareness of the strength she carried, the shield she had become, and the fire in her words that no one could ignore. He was shaken, but he was safe. And safety, she vowed silently, was something she would fight for every single day, for him and for children like him. The patrol car pulled away, its presence retreating down the quiet street. One by one, the blinds slid shut, the neighborhood folding back into its routine. Yet nothing felt routine anymore. The air held the weight of what had been revealed, and the silence was filled with an unspoken question. What would they choose to see next time? As the last light of day slipped into twilight, Ethan's hand remained firmly in his mother's. Together, they stepped toward the house, the door opening to welcome them in. Behind them, the street lay still, but the truth echoed stronger than silence, sharper than judgment, impossible to forget.